Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and civil government. My name is Eric Loophole. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. As a note, this will be the last episode for this season, and then I'll take about a month break or so before picking it back up again for season 6. But before we move forward with this episode, I just want to let you know about the Future of Christendom Conference this October 2025, October 9th through 11th in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So it is going to be a good opportunity to equip yourself with biblical truth and gain a deeper understanding of the challenges that face Christians today. And the theme of this year's conference is No Other Name, the Supremacy of Christ Amidst Cults and Counterfeit Faiths. And the keynote speaker will be Pastor Jeff Durbin from Apologia Church. And so I hope that you will consider attending. I myself will try to be there, at least for most of the conference. But if you do decide to sign up for the conference, you can get a 10% discount off your registration fee by just using the code Governed by God. So when you go to futureofchristendom.org, you can sign up and use the code Governed by God, all one word, to get 10% off of your registration. So again, I hope to see you there October 9th through 11th in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Now, with that, speaking about No Other Name and the supremacy of Christ and its cults and counterfeit faiths, I want to take a look at today, as the final episode of Season 5, I want to look at the issue of statism. Now, I've talked about statism before, all right? It's been a while since I think we've covered this topic, and there are a few things that I want to say in light of the July 4th holiday and things like that. So when we talk about statism, we're talking about idolatry of the state. Okay. Now, let me give you a little bit of context. So recently I was at a family gathering for 4th of July, and I was engaged in a conversation with a family member. Keep the person anonymous. But I mentioned that the government takes too much in taxation. And this person criticized me for saying that the government taxes too much, and argued essentially that, we need the money to do all the things that we need to do. And I guess by we, the person meant the civil government or the federal government. So now the conversation didn't really go on from there. We kind of dropped it and moved on to the next topic. But my question for everyone to think about and ask themselves is this: is there ever a limit to the government? I mean, honestly now, ask yourself, what is the limit? When would taxation be too much? And what would you do, or what should we do, when that line is crossed? So just hold that question in your mind, because I'm not going to give you an answer right now, but I want that to spark some thinking about idolatry. And when we talk about idolatry, it's not just about people bowing down before a statue. Yeah, that is idolatry. That's a very simple version of idolatry. Modern idolatry is a bit more subtle than that. And I will say this, though, even in modern forms of idolatry, eventually, if you do it long enough, you will bow down before something. And I mean physically bow down. It can happen. There are many steps down that road, but that is the eventual outcome of idolatry in the heart. Now, there are several books out there that I highly recommend on the topic of idolatry. One of them is a book by Richard Lintz, Lints, called Identity and Idolatry: The Image of God and Its Inversion. So now he goes through the concept of image and likeness in Scripture, especially through the Old Testament, particularly in Genesis. And then he analyzes the whole concept of idolatry. And I want to read to you just a couple, they're about a paragraph long each, quotations of this book about what he says is the final, big picture idea of idolatry. So here's the first quotation. Quote, "At the heart of worship is a sense of giving yourself away to another. Genuine worship is giving yourself to the living God, in whom and for whom you have been created. Idolatry, by contrast, is substituting the true object of worship, God, for an imitation, idol. and reorienting the relationship from worship to possession. One who worships the living God does not possess him for one's own purposes, but those who create an idol seek to possess it for their own purpose. End quote. There you see the first idea, an exchange of some kind. We're supposed to seek God because of who he is, not to get something from him, okay? But with idolatry, it's really a means to an end. You are going to the idol in order to get something, okay? Let's go to the next quote. Quote, "An idol is desired as a means to an end, and the end is significance and security on the individual's own terms. But a strange reality sets in with idols. Since significance and security cannot be fulfilled by the idol creates a deeper longing for significance and security for that which it cannot provide. This results in a chasing after that idol, driven by the conviction that eventually the idol will somehow provide the promised significance and security. The cycle repeats itself. Longing provides the opportunity to chase, and chasing creates a deeper longing. Effectively, the idol possesses the one who fashioned it. The yearning for significance and security that initiated the dynamic of idolatry has in fact led to a deeper dissatisfaction and a greater frustration. A dissatisfaction and frustration caused by inability of the idol to fulfill that which it appeared to promise." End quote. So there you see how, if it is the case that only the one true God can fulfill your needs, specifically the need for significance and security. So identity and significance kind of go hand in hand, and then security or protection and safety, or you could say provision, food, clothing, all the things. If only God can provide those things, then when you go to something else that's not God, it won't work. But the thing lies to you, and it keeps promising things it cannot deliver. So you end up in this vicious cycle of depression and dissatisfaction, frustration and sadness, but you keep going back to the same thing, hoping that the next time will be different, but it never is. And that's the spiral, if you will, of idolatry. So again, Richard Lind's Identity and Idolatry. Now, how does this concept apply to the state, or should we say the civil government? Well, let me just define my terms a little bit. When I mean the state or the civil government, I kind of use them interchangeably. But I am talking about the greatest manifestation of human power on earth. And I want you to recall to mind the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the idea was, after the flood, all of mankind decided that they're going to build this tower to reach heaven by their own power and their own strength. And they say that they want to make a name for themselves. That's Genesis 11, verse 4. Okay? And they also say that they don't want to be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So they are explicitly going against God's command to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, to spread out and fill the earth. They're not going to do that. They're going to stay together in one location, and they're going to make a name for themselves. And then this is not in the text, but it is a reasonable explanation. They had just come out of the trauma of the flood, or, that story of the flood. The events of the flood are not that far in the past. And so some have suggested that by building a tower to reach the highest heavens, they would be able to escape a future flood. That if God tried it again, they would thwart him, because no flood would be able to stop their high tower of Babel. But in the end, God dispersed them. Now, it's ironic that Babel comes right after the flood, because in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, we have what a lot of theologians have argued is the institution of the civil government. Genesis 9:6 says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." So this is kind of a new thing. In the past, there was no death penalty. But now we have a situation where God says, okay, from now on, anybody who kills another person, they ought to be put to death. So, like I said, previous theologians have argued this is the institution officially by God of the civil government, the power of the sword. Okay, the state wields the sword of vengeance, which previously was not allowed to be wielded by the family, which is why Cain was not put to death for the murder of his brother Abel. So you have God establish civil government, and then immediately, a couple chapters later, that civil government turns tyrannical and idolatrous, worshiping itself and seeking its own significance, a self-made glory without God. Okay, and the result is that God scatters and confuses and essentially prevents a consolidation of power and really is decentralizing human power over the face of the earth to get them to spread out and to fill the earth and be fruitful and multiply. So now the desire to return to Babel is an idolatry of the state, and that's a theme that has come up throughout history. Dostoevsky talks about the return of Babel when he describes socialism in Russia and things like that. So now I want to move on to another book that also talks about idolatry by an author of the name of Herbert Schlossberg. Now his book is titled Idols for Destruction. Now he's specifically targeting idols in American culture. And he talks about money and power and all kinds of things. But the one I want to focus on is the idolatry of power, or specifically the civil government. And he quotes multiple philosophers to show that this is a real thing. These are non-Christian philosophers. He quotes Hegel, who argues that the universal is to be found in the state. The state is the divine idea as it exists on earth. We must therefore worship the state as the manifestation of the divine on earth. And the state is essentially the march of God throughout the world. Now, that's pretty strong, idolatrous language. Then he quotes another philosopher, Arthur Schlesinger, who says that it is only the action of the state that can solve our spiritual problem and lead us to the promised land. And these are just a few of the philosophers that Schlossberg quotes regarding the idolatry of power. And the idea here is that only the state can save us or provide that security that we need. He says, quote, that it can provide salvation from disaster, named or unnamed. And then he says this, he says, those who can be convinced that survival is at stake are likely to agree to almost any remedy, since extinction seems worse than all the alternatives. If placing extraordinary powers in the hands of political leaders will truly stave off the ultimate disaster, then those who demur can be made to appear as enemies of the human race. So what's he saying there? He's saying if you believe that the state is going to be your ultimate hope of security and provision for meeting your needs and keeping you safe and giving you purpose, then you can be convinced, as long as they say, hey, this is an existential threat, this is a catastrophe, things are going bad, we need to do this, we need this money, we need this power. Think of COVID, for example. We need to lock down. We need you to wear masks. We need to shut down non-essential businesses. You can't sing in church. You can't stand up. All these things. But if you actually believe that the state is to provide all these things for you, then you can be convinced to give up, really any number of freedoms. And you can give extraordinary power to the civil magistrate so that he can do his job of saving you. But of course, keep this in mind. This is what Schlossberg brings up, that those who speak against the government will be labeled as enemies of the human race because, hey, wait a second, the government is going to save us. The government's going to provide our needs and solve these problems. And who are you to criticize the government? And do you hate people? Do you hate the poor? Do you hate children and the homeless? And the minorities and the oppressed and all these things. And that's what happens. Those who criticize the civil government get ridiculed by those who idolize the civil government. And this idolatry leads to a blindness where you kind of ignore the faults of the civil government, or you kind of explain them away. Like if something bad happened, well, it's not their fault, or they tried really hard, or they just needed more money, or they needed more authority, or there were these individuals that really didn't buy into it. There are these radicals or these conservatives that, they just didn't play along. If only that everyone did their part, it would have worked. But because a few people didn't do their part. That was kind of the idea with regards to masking during COVID. The idea was that it only worked if everybody did it, right? So if just a few people don't wear masks, then the whole thing is bunk and is not going to work. So the reason why COVID wasn't stopped is because we had those few people that didn't play along, those few people that did not put the mask on, and they ruined it. It would have worked had everyone just did their part. Demanding absolute perfection and absolute obedience. So that's what ends up happening with idolatry. And then another idea is that when you idolize the state, you begin to view the state as your father. And Schlossberg brings this up in his chapter on Our Father, the State. And he quotes the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who basically viewed himself as the watchful parent of the whole human race. And then Schlossberg later states, quote, "We rightly learn to expect food from parents, and when we regard the state as the source of physical provision, we render to it the obeisance of idolatry." Now, I want to pause there because he mentioned the expectation of food from parents. And for those of you who are not familiar with what's going on in New York City, I myself, by the way, only recently became familiar with this, but there is a socialist, a legitimate socialist, who just won the Democratic primary and essentially is probably going to win election as mayor of New York City. This man is Zohran Mamdani, and he's a Muslim and a socialist. And he's advocating for things like government-run grocery stores. So I want you to listen very carefully to this interview that took place at the end of May of this year of Mr. Mamdani. And I want you to just listen to what he has to say regarding his understanding of the government and its purpose. So let's go ahead and see what he has to say.
What would democratic socialism actually look like at City Hall for you?
So to me, democratic socialism is a belief that every person should have what they need to live a dignified life, and that it's local government's job to ensure that. And when you look across the city, you ask New Yorkers, there's a general understanding that if we're talking about K through 12 education or sanitation or libraries, that this is something that's a public good. But there are so many other things that we understand are just as critical to living a dignified life that we're pricing people out of. If it's their rent, if it's their food, if it's their childcare, these are not negotiable things. These are things that every New Yorker needs to call the city their home. And ultimately what a city hall would look like under the leadership of a democratic socialist mayor is a city hall that is fairer, a city hall that puts working people at the heart of it, and a city hall that understands that in this country, where we have seen income inequality decline, we're seeing it rise in our city, and we have to bring an end to that.
So let me pause there. That's the first part of that clip. So hear what he had to say there. He viewed that the job of the government is to provide all these needs, and that there's more than just, public transportation, things like that, that all these needs need to be met for people to have a dignified life. And essentially, he is presenting the civil government, in this case, the city government, as a father figure. The father is going to provide education and healthcare and welfare and food and all the provisions. He's going to drive you around just like a parent does a child, drive you from baseball game to soccer game to the library. That's going to be the father now. The civil government is going to do these things. And that is what Schlossberg is talking about regarding idolatry. So now Mr. Mamdani moves into the topic specifically of government-run grocery stores. So let's hear what he has to say about that.
To that end, you've proposed city-run grocery stores, fare-free public transit. Supporters certainly say that your plans are bold, but your critics call them unrealistic. How do you plan to fund these ideas without driving away business or middle-class taxpayers?
So let's take these two examples. A network of municipal-run grocery stores, one in each borough, so 5 in total, would cost the city $60 million. The city is already set to spend more than $140 million subsidizing corporate supermarket chains without any guarantee of affordability from that subsidy. So this is less than half of what we're already set to spend. When it comes to fare-free buses, the cost of that is about $700 million a year. That's in the context of a city budget of $115 billion, a state budget of $252 billion. And what we've put forward is a plan to raise $10 billion a year that would make those buses free, pay for universal childcare, and give us the fiscal flexibility to Trump-proof our city by raising taxes on the most profitable corporations in the state to match that of New Jersey's top corporate tax rate, 11.5%, and by raising taxes on the top 1% of New Yorkers who make $1 million a year or more by a flat 2% increase, just $20,000, which for someone making $1 million is more like a rounding error.
So let me stop there. So you saw what he had to say about that. He argued that, hey, the government of New York is already subsidizing private grocery stores. Now stop right there. I think, from a biblical perspective, that is unnecessary and wrong. The government should not be subsidizing private grocery stores. Now, why would they do that? Why does the government do that? Well, the government, essentially what they're doing is they take money from everybody, and then they give that money to grocery stores. Basically, they're paying some of the cost of the groceries, so then the grocery store can lower its prices of the groceries. Because, normally the grocery store would have to charge, I don't know, this many dollars for a gallon of milk, right? In order to make a profit, okay? In order to get the price down, the government says, hey, we will supply you with most of your profit or a good chunk of your profit so that you can lower the prices of your groceries. So we're taking money from everybody, giving it to you to lower prices so that everybody can buy groceries at a reduced cost. Now, is that efficient? Very doubtful. Essentially, it's a shell game. The government is taking people's money, giving it to the grocery store so that people don't have to give as much money to the grocery store. But in that process, the money changed hands several times, and certainly the government took their fair share as an administrative fee. And so, at the end of the day, the people are probably really not any better off. It just looks better. The prices of the groceries look better, but they're still paying that kind of money in their taxation. But he's saying, hey, just take it one step further. We are providing all this money and subsidies to grocery stores to lower their food prices. That's $140 million a year. We can just have government-run grocery stores at $60 million a year. Now, honestly, I don't know how he's going to do that, and I can't wait to see the quality and the variety of groceries in the government-run grocery store. And I highly doubt it's going to be like a Wegmans. I'm just saying that right now. I highly doubt it's going to be like that. It's never like that. But his argument is, well, there's a cheaper way to do it if the government just does it itself. It's just cheaper than subsidizing. And that's why the government shouldn't subsidize in the first place, because it's already playing footsie with socialism when it subsidizes. And then when it starts spending all this money, it just realizes, well, hey, I could spend less if I just do it myself. Okay, but the quality that you get is going to be much, much less. So I want to read a quote now from Schlossberg in his book, Idols for Destruction. He says this. He says, "The crowd who had fed on the multiplied loaves and fishes were ready to receive Christ as the ruler, not because of who he was, but because of provision." So that was an interesting reference to the feeding of the 5,000. And even Jesus points that out when they are following him. And he says, you're just here because I fed you. And then he goes on to talk about who he really is and what they're supposed to do. And they start to abandon him. So then Schlossberg goes on to say this, quote, "The paternal state not only feeds its children, but nurtures, educates, comforts, and disciplines them, providing all they need for their security. This appears to be a mildly insulting way to treat adults, but it is really a great crime because it transforms the state from being a gift of God, given to protect us against violence, into an idol. It supplies us with all blessings, and we look to it for all our needs. Once we sink to that level, as C.S. Lewis says, there is no point in telling state officials to mind their own business. Our whole lives are their business. The paternalism of the state is that of the bad parent who wants his children dependent on him forever. That is an evil impulse. The good parent prepares his children for independence, trains them to make responsible decisions, knows that he harms them by not helping them to break loose. The paternal state thrives on dependency. When the dependents free themselves, it loses power. Keep that in mind. When the people lose dependency on the state, it loses power. So it must possess them. And that's what an idol does, which we just read in Richard Lindt's book, Identity and Idolatry. I mean, these two books are just lining up so well, and I highly doubt that these men knew each other, but they're getting the same ideas, and they're seeing, hey, idolatry is about significance and security, and hey, guess what? When you want that, it ends up you become possessed, tyrannized by the state. You don't possess it, it possesses you. And then I'll finish this one quote from Schlossberg. He says this: the idol state uses the language of compassion because its intention is a messianic one. It finds the masses harassed and helpless like a sheep without a shepherd. So that's what Schlossberg says about the state. When it becomes an idol, it fills the role of the Messiah. And think of the language that Mr. Mamdani just said there. It's this very compassionate language. These people need dignity. How can they have their lives without these things? It's terrible. And so the people are viewed as this flock of sheep without a shepherd. And the state, the civil government, is going to be that shepherd. Now, the last book I want to just briefly cover is a book called Crisis and Leviathan by Robert Higgs. Now, in this book, he talks about what's called the ratchet effect. Now, the ratchet effect is where a crisis comes about, or a perceived crisis comes about. It doesn't have to be a real crisis, okay? But this crisis results in the government growing itself. It becomes bigger, takes more money, gains more power, things like that. Now, the government promises to give all of that back and to shrink itself back to its previous state after the crisis passes, but that never happens. It never shrinks back to its original state. It maybe shrinks back a fraction, but most of the time it just keeps what it has. All right? And he goes to show, using data all throughout history, that, like, for example, since 1900, government spending has grown 5 to 6 times larger than the economy has grown. So you have the economy growing over the past 100 plus years. Well, however much the economy grew, the government grew 5 or 6 times as much, larger than the economy. And he shows that government spending was less than 10% of gross national product in 1900, but now it's between 30 and 40% of gross national product today, which is a huge percentage, right? And so this expansion is what he calls the ratchet effect. And here's how Higgs summarizes his point. He says this, quote, "The expansion phase of the ratchet reflects the decisions of a quasi-autonomous government responding to an insistent but ill-defined public demand that the government do something about a crisis." And so what's he saying there? Something happens, and everyone says, government, do something about this injustice, do something about this. And so the government is like, of course I will. Of course I'll. Happy to do it. You just have to give me more money, more power, more control, and I will happily do it for you. But the problem is that what they're asking the government to do is not what God designed it to do. God designed the government for a very narrow and specific function in Romans 13, to be the deacon of God, to bear the sword of vengeance, punishing evil and praising the good, really administering justice. That's what it's supposed to be doing. But when people ask it to do more than that, it's going to fail. But it's going to keep trying. And so that is statism. And as we begin to view more and more problems as crises that need to be solved by the state is called upon, and at that point, no sacrifice is too great. Hey, it needs more money, give it more money. You need roads, hey, you need taxes. You need roads, public schools, fire department, hey, soon public grocery stores. You need all that, hey, taxation. No sacrifice is too much to get what you want. And so that brings me back to my conversation with my family member. My family member has no problem with 30 to 40% taxation, right? But does it matter to that person that our government had a balanced budget for 25 years after the Civil War without having an income tax? No income tax and a balanced budget for a quarter century. That's something to think about. So ultimately, like any idol, the state will fail when it is treated like an idol. But like I said, the state makes excuses for why the failure happened. There's enemies within, not enough power, not enough money. And furthermore, since it is an idol that will never work, when it fails, people become depressed, and they get particularly upset when the idol is in the wrong hands. So like when the opposing political party has control of the government, they win the elections, the other side gets very demoralized and very depressed because, well, think about it. All your hope was placed in the civil government, and now the other side has the power. They're the ones in charge of the civil government. And so it floors you that your idol is now in the hands of the enemy. So people fall into despair and despondency. And there's a greater effort to regain control of the idol. We must take it back. We must win the next election. Now, I say all that to point out, what is the answer then to statism? If statism is something that's happening right now, even among Christians, what's the answer? Well, I will say this. The answer is not separatism. So what do I mean by separatism? I'm referring to those movements that distance themselves from politics. Not necessarily even as extreme as like the Amish or Mennonites or whatever, because there are some groups that would say, don't even get involved, don't even vote, don't even pay attention. It's not the business of a Christian to get involved in politics or civics. But even lesser forms of that, just going about your business, not really thinking about who's in charge or what they're doing, not advocating for anything, not praying for your rulers, not speaking out against wicked policies and practices. That separatism, to distance yourself from politics and civics, is foolish. And I know it's a strong word, but it's foolish. And here's why it's foolish. Because idols, and the government can be an idol, and today it is, idols are not defeated by ignoring them. Let me say that again. You do not defeat idols by ignoring them. This is in fact why God criticized the kings of Israel and Judah so much. What did they do? They wouldn't take out the high places. They ignored the idolatry that was going on within their borders. Even some of the good kings didn't fully get rid of the idols. So when an idol is ignored like a weed, it grows until it dominates the entire garden, the entire yard. So idols are defeated by spiritual power through the word of God and the proclamation of the gospel. How does that happen? Well, statism, like I said before, is an idolatry of something that God created that is good, civil government. So God instituted civil government to be his deacon, to bear the sword of vengeance and punish the evildoer, Romans 13. Now, the problem, though, is that idolatry takes something that is good and puts it in the place of God. So instead of being God's deacon, the civil government is now being treated as God himself. And that's not right. It is supposed to exist and serve God, not to play God. So Christians have a duty to call out idolatry and to call for civil government to go back into its rightful place, calling their leaders to do what God says for them to do and to stop playing God or ignoring God. All right? And that's what preachers should be doing, as the text comes up in Scripture or as certain policies come up, and Christians should be writing letters and calling their civil magistrates and certainly praying for them, praying for their repentance, praying that they stop putting themselves in the place of a Messiah and just really view themselves as God's deacons, as God's servants. That's where we get the term civil servant from. They're supposed to serve, right? They're not supposed to be the idols. And we need to call out fellow Christians for idolizing these people and for demanding that the government fix all their problems. Or when something bad happens, they get mad that the state or the city or the federal government didn't solve it. No, that should not be the way that we think. Our first answer should not be, where's the federal government? Where's PEMA? Where's FEMA? Where are all these groups? No, that is a idolatrous perspective. Even if Christians don't realize it, it's an idolatrous perspective. And so that's the mindset we need to adopt as Christians, even if we don't run for office, or even if we don't vote. Now, I think we should be voting. It's a stewardship of civil power that we've been given. But even if we don't run for office or don't campaign for people, we need to call out idolatry and use God's word, God's law, and the gospel against that idolatry so that the idol can be toppled and the civil government can go back to doing what it's supposed to be doing. And so that's why, and this is the namesake for the podcast, but that's why William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, said that if men will not be governed by God, they will be ruled by tyrants. If you engage in idolatry, or if you allow for idolatry to happen and you don't correct it or address it, eventually you will get tyranny. It's just a matter of time that the weed grows. And so, anyways, that'll do it for this season of Governed by God. If you have any comments or questions or topics that you'd like me to cover in the next season, please email me at thegbgpodcast@gmail.com or go to ericloophole.com and you can submit a message or question to me there via the website. And so, again, I thank you for listening this season. And until next season, take care and